Okay, with that said, like I said to Corey a moment ago, we're going to build on some work here from the last couple of years, right? And we're going to start with Mexico and move a little farther afield and see something very interesting. So last year I explored how a native figure was used on early Mexican coins to signify both Mexico and Mexican liberty. This year I will show that the Mexican case is part of a larger pattern throughout the Americas. In addition to Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, and even the US employed native figures on their newly independent coinage for the same purpose. This practice is rooted in a wider tradition of portraying America as a native woman and traces back to initial efforts to depict and organize people into races, as I'll show you in a moment. So what's really interesting here is that we have former colonies like Colombia, Costa Rica, and Mexico of the Spanish imperial regime, and even a British colony doing the same thing. So this is truly a pan or trans-American phenomenon here that it turns out Mexico is a part of. Let's begin by looking at some of the imagery that gave rise to what ends up on the coins, okay? And we'll start looking at this figure I call Native America first. Early in the colonial era, Westerners came to view the world as composed of 4 continents, each personified by its own race and signature indigenous avatar, often a woman. America is depicted semi-nude with a feathered headdress and skirt bearing native arms, bow, arrow, and quiver. She is commonly portrayed with, and sometimes riding, exotic American animals like an armadillo, an alligator, or a parrot. And she's frequently associated with a cornucopia, signifying her riches, and a severed human head, signaling her savage nature. Let's explore this foundation imagery. And the best place to start is with maps, because maps show us both the quadripartite dividing of the world and the imagery associated with it. This is a Stupendal map from 1730. It shows us the Americas as having their own hemisphere, and the Old World is being divided into Europe, Asia, and Africa. So a quadripartite division of the world, to be matched in the corners by figures of Europa, Asia, Africa, and America. Each of the 4 races corresponding to one of the 4 continents in this world view from the time. All right? And it's this image right here that we're most interested in today. These images were widely recognized, and even very early on. Here's a version of America from 1590. So less than 100 years after Columbus was first plying the Caribbean, this representation of America was cooked up. And you see her, she's riding a giant armadillo. There's a parrot over here, she's semi-nude. She's got a tomahawk, she's got a feathered headdress, she's got a quiver, and she's got a bow in her hands. Many of the quintessential elements of this figure throughout time, and even on coins in centuries later, basically. The image was quite popular to the point that the Meissen porcelain factory actually made figurines of this. Indeed, there were at least 6 different sets of these figurines that I've been able to identify, and they made a profit by selling these things. That's how well disseminated this imagery was. This, of course, is one of the America figures here, and we'll zoom in on another one and look at some of its components. Now we see the cornucopia. Here's our alligator. She's got a feathered skirt. There's our parrot, feathered headdress, and of course she's semi-nude, unlike the other races and other continents, Asia, Africa, and Europe, who are usually depicted fully clothed, all right? And here's a version from the frontis to the Jean Blanc Atlas of the World from 1662. I think we can safely say she's America, all right, because she's very clearly labeled as such up here. Here she has her arrow in her hand, but you can see most of the other features are present. That's an alligator, but the thing I want to call your attention to that we haven't seen yet is the head. All right, so she stands with her foot trampling a human head. It looks to be a European head with an arrow through it. Again, signaling from the perspective of Europeans, her savage nature. all right? Now, with that foundation laid, let's take a look at some of the coinage that draws imagery from this pool of images. All right, and we'll begin with a brief summary of what I presented here last year. So, Native Mexican liberty. Mexico adopted the American figure into its own native liberty icon in the years surrounding its War of Independence, as you know, from 1810 to 21. She's often accompanied by a cornucopia, as we've seen. She wears a feathered headdress, an embroidered huipil gown. All right, that's a native Mexican, Central American gown, marking her not just as the Americas, but as Mexico. And she bears indigenous weapons, a quiver, Aztec sword, etc. On colonial art and metals, she embodied Mexican dependency, that is subordination to Spain, and is often juxtaposed with Minerva representing Spain. After independence, the same figure was rebranded as Liberty to personify Mexican autonomy, a sort of Dia Mexica or anti-Aztec, kind of along the lines of our Uncle Sam, a theme I'll hit again shortly. So we'll take a look just at two coins from Mexico and the imagery that led up to them, right? But there are others that bear this indigenous theme as well. They're not necessarily the dominant theme of the time, but they're certainly a present theme in the wake of independence. And so let's take a tour through some of the imagery that led up to the first of these two coins. And I begin here with this medal issued under the reign of Ferdinand VI. And what you notice is, here's a Native American figure kneeling, a very subordinate position, accompanied by Africa, you can see the elephant mask, Asia, and Europe, which is personified by Spain. How do we know? That's a rabbit at her feet. And a rabbit has been the symbol of Spain since Roman times, okay? And they are all standing before Ferdinand VI. Ferdinand VI enjoys a priority position at left, and he is larger than any of the other figures. They're clearly subordinated to him. This shows him as the ruler of the world, all four continents, okay? And what's important about this medal is it shows us the migration of this continental / racial imagery, not just on porcelain and books and maps and such, but onto numismatic media. So clearly the artists who were creating the numismatic issues of the world were aware of this imagery, okay? We scoot a little farther along to 1780, and we find another medal issued in Mexico, but again, under the regime of New Spain. And here we have Spain depicted as Minerva. There's the Spanish escutcheon over there. There's the rabbit. And she is presenting the newly born Prince Charles to native New Spain or Mexico. And if you look, you'll see all of our features here: bows, arrows, quiver, feathered headdress. She's wearing a huipil gown. There's the cornucopia. And she has an escutcheon behind her that is clearly a Mexican eagle on the cactus, right? And she's definitely in a subordinate position. She's on the right, which is a secondary position, and she's kneeling before the towering figure of Spain in front of her. So dependency in the early versions before independence. Now let's flip to after independence. In fact, immediately after independence. This very scarce medal was issued before 1821 was even concluded, right? And it shows our native Mexico figure. Now what's she doing? Is she kneeling still? She's standing. Where is she? Is she in the secondary position on the right, or is she in the primary position on the left? She's in the primary position on the left. Iturbide is actually relegated to the secondary position on the right, subordinating him to Mexico, his mother country. This is quite a powerful ethno-political statement that's being made on this medal right here. Her resurrection in this fashion as a sign of Mexican independence, in this case, essentially lays the foundation for the coin that I want to touch on next, and the medal that preceded it. Okay, this is the medal from 1828. It shows us our native Mexico figure. She's now seated on a pedestal, and I'll go through her features here shortly. but I'll call your attention to the fact that arching overhead is the term free Mexico, basically. So she's definitely not a symbol of subordination here. She's a symbol of autonomy, right? This same medal then was reproduced on coins from the state of San Luis Potosi, or I should say the same design. Here you see our figure. It's native Mexico. It's virtually identical to what we just looked at, including even the same phrase, arching overhead. And it was issued from 1828 to 1862, all right? I could go into the significance of that more, but I'll do that at another time over beers or something, all right? But in the meantime, let's take a quick look at what she's got going. Here's her pedestal. Here's our nopal cactus, emblematic of Mexico. This is an arrow. How do we know? Because on coins it's fletched, right? That's a Phrygian cap, which establishes her not just as native Mexico, but as what? Freedom. Freedom, liberty, okay? She has her feathered crown, her bow and quiver, and that is a macuahuitl, which is an Aztec sword. So that's telling us that she's not just an image of America, she's an image of Mexico, because that is a Mexican weapon right there, as Mexican as her huipil gown. And there's our cornucopia. So you can see a lot of the imagery is carrying over from this earlier racial and continental imagery, right? And we also see it reflected in other artistic media during the same time. Here's an anonymous allegory from 1834, and if you look, you see her seated on a pedestal. She's got her quiver, she's got her bow and arrow, her headdress, her arrow with the Phrygian cap on it. And in this case, she's basically being anointed by Hidalgo and Iturbide. And over here we have the vanquished Ferdinand VII. And you see the macuahuitl hidden in the background here. And there's other features of this symbolism present in this painting. It's actually a really interesting painting. So the coinage, the medals, clearly reflecting imagery that goes way beyond the bounds of just numismatic media. Here is one of my favorite portrayals. This is the coronation of Iturbide by Jose Ignacio Paz from 1822. It's an allegory. This actual scene never took place, but it shows Iturbide being crowned here, and who's standing to his left, on his left, with a macuahuitl in her hand. That's our figure, our native Mexico liberty figure there, basically. My personal favorite happens to be this portrait of Iturbide's wife, Empress Ana Maria Huarte de Iturbide, an anonymous allegory from 1822. She is actually dressed up as native Mexico in this. So she's clearly signaling that she is Mexico, which is a hell of a power statement to make in the political arena right here. This is amazing kind of stuff. All right, it's the equivalent of sort of some of the most powerful memes and things that you would see on social media and that sort of thing today. And lastly, I'll remind you that this figure actually came alive in the course of some processions and things like that in Mexico. So here we see a procession to the Church of Carmen in San Luis Potosi, which happens to be the town that issued those coins. And who's in it? She is, right? And this is really cool because this procession takes place in 1865. Who ruled Mexico in 1865? Maximilian, the French, right? This is an incredibly subversive statement right here. This is probably the people of San Luis Potosi, I would say, thumbing their noses or basically telling the French regime to stuff it by parading their native identity around like this. Pretty amazing stuff. Now, just to show again that this is not limited to simply San Luis Potosi issues, but can be found on other releases in Mexico. Just take a quick look at one of the state copper series from Chihuahua, which some of you are probably already familiar with. After independence, a native figure was introduced on a series of fractional copper reales issued in Chihuahua between 1833 and 1856. What we find is a frontal standing native at center on the obverse. It looks like a male with a bow, arrow, quiver, tunic, and plumed headdress, and an encircling legend that celebrates state autonomy. So the last one celebrated Mexican autonomy. This celebrates Chihuahuan autonomy. The figure resembles a Chichimec. The Chichimec were the ancestors of the Aztec and indeed of Mexico. And they're considered, at least in the 19th century, by many Mexicans to be emblematic of humanity in its wild, native, free state. All right? And it could also help to celebrate the indigenous allies of the revolutionary insurgents. Because remember, the War of Independence in Mexico never would have been won if all those native peoples hadn't signed up and helped with the revolt, basically. And interesting, low denominations like this probably reach some of those very natives who are depicted on it. That may be part of what's going on here too, is to try to bring them in and solidify their connection with the new free states of Mexico. So here is one of those coins. You can see we have a standing figure in the middle, and we have a legend that surrounds it that in Spanish says sovereign state of Chihuahua, clearly celebrating the sovereignty or autonomy of Chihuahua. And if we looked at the features more closely, quiver, bow, arrow, plumed headdress, you can barely make it out. Most of these are either so weathered or poorly struck that you can't see some of the details. And the individual has a tunic. So perhaps a male, not sure at this point. But it certainly looks comparable to this painting of a Chichimec by Manuel Arellano from 1711. Arrow, quiver, bow, feathered headdress, very much like this. So I think what we have here is an ancestral Chichimec figure on this coin, pointing out that Chihuahua is claiming its heritage goes back to the original Mexicans, the people from whom the Aztecs themselves derive. Okay? Now, let's go a little bit farther afield and look at some stuff that might not be quite as familiar, but you might be surprised to see how much it echoes what we've seen already. We'll begin with Colombia, and we'll start with Cartagena. Revolutionary Colombia issued coins with Native American figures as well, beginning with Cartagena, the epicenter of separatism in Colombia. Following its declaration of independence in 1811, Cartagena released a series of copper reales from 1812 to 1815, so even earlier than the Mexican ones that we just saw. The obverse features a native woman seated before a palm, a turpial bird eating from a pomegranate in her hand. That is the iconographic program, and we'll take it apart in a moment. It depicts, in fact, the coat of arms of autonomous Cartagena, the pomegranate or granada representing sovereign New Granada, which is what they called themselves at the time. And it also, like we just saw in Mexico, echoes other rebel art of the time. So, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Colombian geography, here's a map from the Independence War era. In pink, we have the loyalist areas, and in sort of mustard, we have the rebel areas. We're going to start by looking at this coin from Cartagena, and then we'll look at another one from Cundinamarca, which is down in this region right here. Here is the coin from Cartagena, not a terribly sophisticated coin in terms of its realization and everything. But if we take it apart and look at what it's got in it, here's our coconut palm. There's our feathered headdress atop the woman's head. Here's the quiver with arrows from it in her back. There's the woman herself, right? This is the bird. You can see the body of the bird, the beak, the wings to the side. And the bird is eating from a pomegranate. See the spikes on it, essentially, that is in the raised hand of the woman here. And you can see some other buildings and trees and things in the background. This is actually the coat of arms of Cartagena. And that's a good thing, because while these features may be difficult to actually recognize on this coin, we have the actual coat of arms from the same year to compare the coin with. And in this, we can see the features much, much more clearly. From the turpial bird, the pomegranate, the woman seated, the quiver with the arrows, the coconut palm, right? And she's even breaking a chain as she wrests herself free from Spanish domination in this image. And we even have a description of what this is supposed to represent. So we know quite clearly, even though the coin itself is not clear, we know quite clearly what is on that coin and what it is meant to depict. And we have a clear, early native figure representing Cartagena and the entire rebel movement here, essentially. All right? And you'll notice that it reflects, as we saw in Mexico, other artistic productions of the time. This one is called The Indian of Liberty. Again, an anonymous allegory from 1819. It's a very similar figure. We have our feathered cap, right? Bow. She's got a lance here with what on it? Phrygian cap of liberty, right? She's got a feathered skirt. It's very similar to what we saw in Mexico. Here's our palm tree in the background. And what do you notice about what she's actually sitting on? There's our alligator from the imagery from centuries before, popping up in the 1800s here. I think clearly telling us that's where this imagery comes from. I don't think there can be any doubt. And whatever little doubt is left is resolved by this image. This one, entitled Simón Bolívar, Liberator and Father of the Fatherland, was painted by Pedro José Figueroa in 1819, and it shows Bolívar embracing this native woman figure who's at least meant to represent Colombia and perhaps even be emblematic of liberty. But what do you see behind her? The palm tree. What little head is sticking out right here? Alligator, okay? And of course, she's a sign of riches and wealth, so we have a cornucopia. All right, one of the interesting things I see, that looks to me like a cacao pod. So this isn't just old world fruit that's depicted here. This includes new world fruit. Yes?
Could you discuss, I mean, they have it coming up, the pomegranate and maybe what you think about the symbolism, what it's bringing to the party here?
Yeah, but basically it's the word pomegranate in Spanish is the same as the word for this new state, Granada, okay? So it's basically using a symbol that sounds the same to represent the others. It's kind of like, what's that kind of language we used to do as kids, where you drew like an I to represent rebus writing. It's like rebus writing. That's exactly what it is, okay? So once more, we see that the coins are reflective of much wider imagery in the society at the time and vice versa. We find that when we look at this next coin from Cundinamarca in Colombia as well. The rebel territory of Cundinamarca emitted a series of silver reales coins bearing busts of our native Mexican icon, both during and after the War of Independence. During the war, they featured her left profile wearing a feathered headdress, flanked by the legend American Liberty on the obverse, a pomegranate for New Granada on the reverse. So it comes back into play here again. As hostilities concluded and freedom took hold in 1820 and 1821, the head remained the same, but the obverse legend was changed from American Liberty and it was replaced by Republic of Colombia as New Granada morphed into the Republic of Colombia. Here is the coin. You can see that native profile on the left, and here you can see the pomegranate beautifully depicted on the reverse with Nueva Granada, Cundinamarca, right here, okay? Let's take a closer look at the obverse. Here it says Libertad Americana, American Liberty. This happens to be one from 1813, but they go back to 1812. This one is in very, very good shape, so you can really see the details of the feathers and the headband and the like. And if we flash forward to after the war is over, we basically have the same figure in this 1821 release, and Libertad Americana has been replaced by República de Colombia, the Republic of Colombia here. In a lot of ways, she has now come to signify the Republic of Colombia. That's virtually labeling her as an image of the Republic of Colombia, all right? Now let's move along to Costa Rica, yet another country in Latin America, right? Costa Rica featured an indigenous woman on its very first constitutional issue in 1847. Mexico and Central America became independent from Spain in 1821, as most of you know. What you might not know is that Central America then became independent from Mexico in 1823 and formed its own federation that lasted for some decades. Finally, Costa Rica became independent from Central America and the Federation in 1847. In commemoration, Costa Rica released a silver real that became a regular issue. A lone coffee shrub adorned the obverse of the coin, and a native Madonna nurses a swathed child on the reverse. The Madonna and the child serve as a metaphor for the birth of the new nation. So again, I'll remind you, Mexico and Central America become independent from Spain in 1821. Central America becomes independent from Mexico in 1823. And Costa Rica finally solidifies its independence from Central America in 1847. So in a sense, Costa Rica has 3 different dates of independence, almost, okay? And I'll get back to that again in a moment. But here is the coin. So this is the obverse, and we know that because we actually have the official description of this coin from before it was created, right? So this is the obverse here with our coffee tree, right? And it refers to a proclamation of reforms in 1846 that first initiated Costa Rica's secession from the Central American Republic. The reverse shows our native women, and the child is covered, basically, right? And it refers to the Constitution of 1847 when Costa Rica finally formalized its independence from Central America. So this is the first sovereign issue of Costa Rica, and it has a native figure on it. Here you can see it a little bit more closely. You can see it refers to La Constitución, abbreviated, and has the date of 1847 over here. If we zoom in a little bit more closely, you can see the female figure, and she's carrying this bundled child, and the child is virtually covered up by the blanket or cloth that it's in, all right? And then when this becomes a regular issue, when it goes from a commemorative to a regular issue, they replace the reference to the Constitution with a reference to Central America here, essentially naming her as Central America on this side of the coin. And that's effectively what's happening on the coin here. But Costa Rica has another incredibly impressive expression of this same kind of native liberty imagery. Native America appears on a Costa Rican gold escudo and gold ounce coins from 1850 to 1863. So again, shortly after full independence. The obverse shows a coat of arms, the escudo of Costa Rica, with a legend, República de Costa Rica, arching above. The reverse, however, shows a female figure who's standing semi-nude with plumed crown, feathered skirt, bow and arrows in hand, leaning liberty-like against a pedestal inscribed with the date of Mexican Central American independence, the 15th of September, 1821, and a legend, Central America, flanking overhead. In a lot of ways, it celebrates the triple independence of Costa Rica. It commemorates the initial independence from Spain, but it's issued when Costa Rica manifests its independence from Central America. Here is the gold version of the coin on the half escudo. You can see the escudo or shield of Costa Rica here on the left, and on the right we've got Central America, and there's our figure. All right. I'm going to zoom in on her though on this 1850 pattern. This is a pattern that's been preserved for the 1 ounce gold coin that year, and I like to use this simply because it's in magnificent condition, so you can really see the details on it quite closely, right? And so if we take a look at those details, she's got a plume on her headdress. She's, bare-breasted above the waist. She's got arrows in her hand along with a bow. She's wearing a skirt, and on the pedestal is the date of independence from Spain, okay? So quite a powerful use of basically the same kind of imagery that we've been seeing in these other countries, all right? So how did it get here to Costa Rica? How is it that Costa Rica ends up doing the same thing that Mexico and Colombia were doing? Well, there's 2 possibilities. Remember, Costa Rica was part of New Spain and Mexico until 1823. right? So Costa Rica may very well have been aware of these symbolic developments in Mexico, to which it had been so closely allied. On the other hand, it's really close to Colombia. And we know that Colombian native liberty coins, remember the profile head with a feathered headdress? Well, hundreds of them have been found in Costa Rica. So they circulated in Costa Rica. Now, that clearly tells us that that imagery was introduced from Colombia. It could have come from both directions, essentially. Or it seems to be such obvious imagery when you're aware of the predecessing imagery, the racial and geographic, the continental imagery, that maybe all of these countries essentially reached for the same answer to the problem of how you define yourself as separate from your former colonial masters, because it was so obvious. But perhaps the biggest surprise for us is that we find similar imagery on early US coins. Again, I've only used two examples for each country. I'm only going to use two here. And I'm going to look at the 1785 Confederatio copper, which is going to look an awful lot like the one we just saw from Costa Rica. Following independence, the Native America figure was appropriated and merged with liberty on an experimental national coin in the US. The obverse features a standing female leaning against a stand, like we just saw, kind of resembling seated liberty. Marked as America by a native quiver at her back, she has a bow in her left hand and an arrow in her right. She's labeled as America by a surrounding legend that in Latin says, America, foe of tyrants, telling us that this is America that's being depicted there. She recalls liberty because she's got a helmet atop a stand next to her, very liberty-like, and her right foot tramples a crown, kind of like, remember the right foot on that America figure from the Blow Atlas that trampled the head, the human head? Well, we see that same kind of imagery being recalled on this early US coin. And in this case, national identity is clearly invoked by the 13 stars and Confederatio legend on the reverse. So she's meant to illustrate America, the United States here. This is the coin. Here's our Confederatio, right? And there are 13 stars, clearly a reference to the United States of America in 1785. And here's our figure that we'll take a closer look at. In 1785, that means this coin is what compared to the others in date? This is the earliest, right? So this phenomenon started in the United States, basically. Here's a close-up of the verse of the coin, and you can see the legend here, America, foe of tyrants, and we'll zoom in on it even a little bit more so you can see the details more closely, and we'll mark them here for you. There's her quiver, there's her bow, the helmet, the pedestal, there's the crown. She's stepping on the crown of England. It doesn't get much more political than that, all right? This is a power statement. And here's her arrow. This is the United States represented as a Native American woman defeating England right here, okay? If you go to the seal or coat of arms of the state of New York, you'll find that that trampled crown motif was adopted on later versions of the coat of arms. Again, once more, reflecting that trampled head that we saw was part of the earlier tradition as well. So all this imagery from centuries before is being readily called back into play by countries throughout Latin America and even here in the United States, all right? In fact, we have the original proposal for that coin. While discussing prospects for the first national coinage of the US, Superintendent of Finance Robert Morris described the initial concept for it. Quote, an Indian, his right foot on the crown, we'll get back to that in a minute, a bow in his left hand, and in his right hand, 13 arrows. Well, they cut it down. It's kind of hard to strike 13 arrows on a coin, all right? And have it legibly be 13 arrows. And the inscription, Manos inimica tyrannis. In other words, not America, foe of tyranny. This hand opposes tyranny was the original version of it. The fact that native liberty was included in this discussion and appears on these test coins tells us that she was considered for and nearly adorned one of the very first US federal coins. That's a hell of a statement about the importance of this imagery. It may be forgotten today, but it was not forgotten in 1785. It almost ended up on our first national coins. But we also, like we saw with Mexico, find the similar imagery echoing on state coppers. In this case, we'll look at New York. After independence, Native American figures were employed on state coppers to represent US identity and liberty, and particularly state identity and liberty. The obverse of the 1787 Excelsior copper from New York features a standing native, perhaps a male, semi-nude and barefoot in a skirt, wearing a feathered headdress and quiver, with a bow and tomahawk in hand. The reverse bears the New York State coat of arms, so clearly referring to the state and its independence. Okay, the native weapons and garb denote indigenous US identity and the natural free state of humanity. The weapons further evoke resistance to subordination. So here is the Excelsior coin, the obverse and the reverse. That is the coat of arms of the state of New York. Notice the crown hasn't been introduced yet, but this is an earlier version of what we just saw a moment ago. And here's our figure. Again, let's zoom in. And we've got a legend surrounding it with lots of interesting elements to it. We've got our quiver, we've got our feathered headdress, semi-nude, bow, barefoot, again signaling that this is a wild person, a skirt, and a tomahawk in hand. And we have a legend, Libertatis Libertatum Defendo, that is literally born free, I defend liberty. So what they're keying into here is a sense that Native Americans in their wild free state are emblematic of the sort of freedom that the United States seeks to manifest from its former colonial ruler, essentially. All right? And you can see that quite literally in the choice of legend that tells us what about her makes her the focus of this coin and the focus of interest at the time. Okay? Let's explore the use of this America's figure on US coinage a little further, because some other interesting things come up when we do that. So let's look at some other media, like we did for other countries, all right? It's long been recognized that such native US allegories of liberty were in part inspired by the English figure of Britannia. So England had a woman that represented England. The United States confected a woman that represented the United States. Early US coins often replaced the colonial Britannia with a nearly identical liberty seated atop the Western Hemisphere with a US escutcheon on her shield and a Phrygian cap atop her lance. Native liberty here was not just modeled after Britannia, but was a direct counterpunch to her, symbolizing a distinctly US identity in opposition to England. And we can see that by looking at independence era political cartoons, some of which I think you're probably going to enjoy. So here is a colonial British coin from here in the US. It shows us Britannia. She's seated upon the world. No big statement there, okay? And she has the Union Jack as an escutcheon over here, offering, of course, an olive sprig with a lance in her left hand. And of course, this dates to 1778, while Britain was still in control of significant portions of the United States. We flash forward a little later, 1787, about 10 years later, and we have the almost identical figure to the olive branch, only now on her lance, she has a Phrygian cap of liberty, and the escutcheon of the Union Jack has been replaced by our New York coat of arms, right? So clearly, there is a connection between these figures and Britannia. And you can see it really well on this 1782 etching, which opposes both the UK and US allegories. Let's take a closer look, all right? Here is Britannia on the left. You see the Union Jack escutcheon. Here is America on the right. We'll take a closer look at her in a moment. Of course, what's she holding behind her? The US flag. Who's standing behind Britannia? That would be the devil. All right, they didn't pull any punches on this stuff, and I'll show you that in a moment. As I did this research, I was really surprised to find out how direct and colorful, right, and even nasty some of these political cartoons were back in the 1780s. But if we zoom in on our America figure, we see that she's sitting on top of America, not the world, just America. That's all the US wants, right? And what's that? That's a bow. And what's here? It's kind of lost in the engraving, but what is it? It's an arrow. She's not just liberty, she's native liberty. In 1782, before those coins that we just saw, right? And as I mentioned, some of these things get pretty colorful. Let's take a look at this cartoon. This is actually from 1776, the year our Revolutionary War initiated. We have an 18th century version of Britannia here, right? What we've been seeing until now is Britannia looking like a classical figure, right? A Greek goddess, basically. Now we have an 18th century version of Britannia. We have our Native American figure here, a woman. Over here it says for liberty. Over here it says for independence. And if we read the captions, America is saying, liberty, liberty forever, mother, while I'll exist. And Britannia is saying, I'll force you to obedience, you rebellious slut. It actually says slut. Right. Britannia is calling America a slut. All right. This is the imagery that they're mining for what's on the coins. And like I said, it does not pull any punches. And you're going to see that again in the next image. And it turns out our figure here is, I guess, what we would call today very gender fluid. She's a female when she needs to be a female for the purpose of the interaction that's taking place, you know, juxtaposing her with a female Britannia. But she can be a male when a male is needed. And here's an example of when a male was needed. A woman can't do that. All right? Right. The title of this cartoon is The General Piss or Peace. And it shows England, the Netherlands, the French, and Spain. And it shows the United States joining them as an equal. And all of them pissing in their common chamber pot. This is from 1783. And in September of 1783, the United States and Britain concluded in Paris the treaty that ended the War of Independence. So this is a cartoon that shows the United States assuming its rightful position as an equal at the piss pot of the Western world, essentially. So like I said, this is some really colorful stuff. I had a riot doing the research for this presentation. I found stuff back there that I never imagined existed back then. And this is just a tiny sample of it right here. Okay, so in the wake of independence, before there was an Uncle Sam or Brother Jonathan, another such figure, the US presented itself as a native liberty, as sort of anti-Algonquin, right? And when you know this, it helps you to see other things. And one of the things that immediately jumped out at me was, I don't know, like many of you, I was raised thinking that the Boston Tea Party was a bunch of colonists donning Native American attire to basically conceal their identities. Well, that may be true, but I think there was a lot more than that going on here. All right, the Boston Tea Party raiders did not just disguise themselves as Native Americans, they assumed a separatist Native American identity. This identity was clearly widely known. If you want to state your independence from England in the United States at this time, you present yourself as a Native American. And so these guys weren't just hiding their identities, they were saying this: we are not England. You have no right to tax us. We are Americans. All right, this is powerful imagery, and we find it throughout the Americas and throughout time. Right, there are some later revivals that are relevant to this. You've probably been thinking of them. Echoing this heritage, Native Liberty has long been revived, especially in bust versions, rendering it one of the most enduring motifs on US and even other coins and paper monies. In the US, from 1854 to today, on Long Acre's Indian head cent, gold dollar and $3, St. Gaudens gold eagle, Pratt's quarter and half eagles, Fraser's buffalo nickel, and the current Sacagawea dollar. She or he is still there, right? And even in the Dominican Republic from 1891 to 1977, we find this figure on native liberty francos, pesos, and centavos, coins and currency. So here is a U.S. Indian head penny from 1859, the initial year of release. She is Native American from her headdress. She is liberty from her headband, and she represents the United States of America. Okay, here she is today on Sacagawea. Once again, a native figure, labeled what? Liberty. And in this case, kind of reminiscent of an image we've already seen, but not from the United States. Can you think of a Native American woman, Madonna-like, with a child? What about that Costa Rican real?
They immigrated, no wall.
Okay. Yeah, there you go. There you go. So this imagery is still with us, and like I said, it's even penetrated other parts of Latin America. Here is a figure. It says Libertad on the headband. She's got the feathered headdress, right? And this is 5 francos from 1891 in the Dominican Republic. That same image was then engraved into a vignette that appeared on virtually most Dominican bills right up to 1977. There's that figure right there on the reverse of it. All right, so this is an all-penetrating figure throughout the Americas, including the United States. So, what do we learn from our survey here? Well, countries across the Americas employed Native American figures on coins to manifest their identity and autonomy. These images were adapted from an existing Western tradition of personifying America as an indigenous woman. This practice harkens back to early efforts to depict as and organize the world's many varied people into races. The various nations evolved, may have emulated each other, and developed and converged on similar symbolic solutions. Ironically, this custom was embraced by states that historically have oppressed Native Americans and devalued women. I mean, think about it. At the time these Native Americans are popping up on these coins, what were most of these countries doing to Native Americans? Killing them, okay? The early use of Native American liberty to signal identity and independence underlies later revivals of such images. So when we look at an Indian head penny now, you gotta think about the heritage that it was building on. We usually think of an Indian head penny relative to the standing and stature of Native Americans in the late 1800s in our country, right? But it's building on this heritage that preceded it by almost a century, all right? This wider phenomenon involved both former colonies from Britain and Spain. That's pretty remarkable, all right? This is not just one colonial sphere that's doing this. The Mexican use of native liberty figures is part of the larger tradition that extends throughout the Americas. So the analysis that I did last fall turns out to be part of a much, much bigger thing. And once again, the importance of currency as a symbolic medium, not just as a monetary instrument, is reaffirmed by our review here. I did want to thank a few people along the way, including Corey and Max, who generously supplied some of the photos. Rogelio Charteriz of the Numismatic Society of Mexico allowed me to photograph his Iturbide medal, which is profoundly difficult to find. Other photos came from heritage auctions, Stacks and Bowers Galleries, and the Prado Museum in Spain. One of my students, who's a Latin scholar, confirmed my translations, all right? Gilles Brombourg and Wartenberg of the ANS also encouraged me to pursue this inquiry. And it was made possible by a suggestion a couple of years ago by Jeff Stahl, who's sitting right there in the second row. And last but not least, I could not do my research without the support of my wife, Beth Eckelman. Okay, so there you have it, folks. Native figures and national identity on early coins from Mexico, Colombia, Costa Rica, and the US. All right? And I'm happy to answer whatever questions you have. Go ahead.
One of the things I think you didn't really explore was that the ambiguity of the imagery. Should this Libertad look European, but wearing a native costume, or should she be much more native looking, on some of the Mexican coins, she's clearly an Indian heritage woman dressed up with Indian costumes, but in the U.S. Liberty had sent, it is a white woman wearing a
Absolutely right.
Indian
Absolutely right.
costume.
And
So
I didn't hit it here
they
simply
couldn't quite
because
make up their
I could
mind.
do a whole talk just on that. Okay, seriously. These people were challenged trying to figure out how to represent Native Americans. On the one hand, they want to extol them as the images, the representatives of us, right? So there's this impulse to make them look white, right? On the other hand, they're Native Americans and they're trying to use them to distinguish us from Europe. So there's also a compulsion to make them look Native American. The other talk that I almost gave today, all right, but it didn't build on what I've been doing here the last couple of years, so I didn't, was a presentation I gave at the National Museum in Mexico City last summer, right, in which I explored the vignette of La Malinche that occurs on the, one of the banknotes from Tabasco around 1900, all right? And I found the source of that vignette. In fact, I traced several images that gave rise to it. And when you look at those images, the very first one shows La Malinche, the consort of Cortez, right, as a Native American woman. In the next generation, that's in 1862. The next version of the same image, from 1885, shows her as a mestiza. And the version of 1892 that ended up on the banknote, the source of the banknote vignette, shows her as a white woman. So part of rescuing La Malinche, right, because in the mid-1800s, she was mostly seen as the whore of Mexico, the woman who had sold out Mexico, basically, to, Spain. They rehabilitated her. That banknote played a role in rehabilitating her, and to rehabilitate her, they had to turn her into a white woman, given the racial politics of the time. So you just touched on a really, really important issue, an issue that's so big and important that it's really an issue unto itself.
And if I could follow it up with another interjection, if you research the images of Benito Juarez, there's a wide variation between him looking very dark and very Indian features, and there's some others where he looks very, very European. I've not met him in person. I couldn't say what he actually looked like in person, but there was definitely a divided thought as to what he should look like.
Right. Now, last year when I gave that presentation in Mexico, and I showed it the day before I gave it to a friend of mine, Leonardo Lopez Lujan, who's probably the top archaeologist in Mexico. He's the one who's digging the Templo Mayor, right? And Mexico doesn't let just anybody dig the Templo Mayor, right? And he's interested in how images like this are used to build national identity. So I showed him that one. And I showed him the progression of changes in La Malinche. And he looks and he says, "Híjoles, la blanquearon." They whitened her. They turned her into a white woman. So skin color and everything is definitely a part of this. There's no doubt. It's harder to see on coins and even on banknotes. But when you look at the associated imagery that surrounds it, that they're drawing on to create these representations, you can see it there. That's where it's quite out in the open, especially when it's in color.
It's kind of on a parallel to that. The same was done with Simon Bolivar.
Yes.
His imagery changes depending on where they kind of want to point his ethnicity.
Right. Yeah, I was talking with Connor about that yesterday, about how widely represented he is on South American currency, and not just one country, but many countries that were liberated by him. And, it's not just the way he's represented, it's whether it's, a full-on representation, a quarter turn, or a profile. I mean, you see all kinds of little nuances worked into how you present Simón Bolívar.
As you see George Washington.
As you see George Washington, exactly the same. Yep.
So certainly not an area of deep knowledge for me, but can you look at the continental currency and how it uses Native American imagery? Because that's another well of the same.
Right, he's saying that, there's another body of iconography here, which is continental currency from before independence. And you're absolutely right. A lot of the Native American representations on it can be tied back to the what became the state seal and coat of arms of the state of Massachusetts, which shows a Native American figure, sort of quarter profile, all right, holding Native American weapons, dressed very much like we see here, looking at a star, essentially ahead of him. So some of this ideology predates the revolution. In those cases, kind of like what we saw in Mexico, I think they represent American dependency. And later, they come to represent American independence. So we see the same image being used for opposite purposes, depending on which side of the revolution you're talking about, basically.
I'm curious if you see a difference, and this may be too high a resolution to get at, given the number of
examples
we have, but a difference between the issues when you're having revolutionaries who essentially are espousing a royalist, oh, Ferdinand VII is fine, but we don't want the Spanish government, versus the, okay, now we've moved, we want full independence and our own national identity.
Oh yeah, you see, like immediately before the War of Independence in Mexico, not on coins but on medals, Mexicans are undergoing an identity crisis, okay? Until this point in time, they have been New Spain, and they've been New Spain for three centuries, basically, all right? But there are already feelings of revolt afoot in Mexico. And at the, right before the Mexican Revolution, and this is not an accident, most of you know, Napoleon invades Spain, and Napoleon deposes Ferdinand VII. And he eventually takes Ferdinand VII prisoner and holds him at hostage in an estate back in France. And so a lot of the people who are emitting these medals, they kind of don't know what to do with that. On the one hand, they certainly don't want to become part of the Napoleonic Empire. On the other hand, they're already thinking about maybe this is time to wrest ourselves free from the Spanish Empire. So they kind of very begrudgingly say that we support Ferdinand VII in his battle against Napoleon. But they can do that safely because they have an Atlantic Ocean between them and Napoleon, right? And then, of course, Napoleon's fortunes flounder, and Ferdinand VII, by the way, Napoleon installed his brother as the head of Spain. And then, Napoleon's fortunes flounder, and his brother is deposed. Ferdinand's brought back and put into power. But by this point, Ferdinand's been basically emasculated. So when the Mexican Revolution took place, it took place precisely at the time that Spain was on its knees, essentially. So Mexicans exploited the vulnerability of Spain at that time. Right, or America, same thing. So, and when you look at the artwork, what you see is this difficulty of trying to figure out, who are we? How are we going to represent ourselves? Are we going to continue to represent ourselves as subjects of Spain? Or, are we going to represent ourselves as something different? So you're absolutely right. It's all over the medals. Not on the coins, but on the medals. Yes?
One thing, and I'm a little rusty on it, but being from back there in Massachusetts, Massasoit, the chief who
Correct.
Wampanoag, who welcomed pilgrims, I believe also shows up on that English documentation for the Massachusetts Bay Colony.
Oh yeah, he's the Bay Colony coat of arms has him on it too. So what they did was they took the Bay Colony seal and they turned that into the Massachusetts seal, right? Only on the Bay Colony, he's a subordinate of the king, and on the Massachusetts seal, he's representing Massachusetts autonomy. So there you see the same figure transformed in its symbolism, depending on whether you're looking at dependency or independence.
It's as early as the 1600s.
As early as the 1600s, yes. As early as the 1600s, absolutely.
And then the other thing is a question when Costa Rica, when you have the Madonna and child that she is literally breastfeeding.
Right.
So would Madonna be Central America and the child be Costa Rica?
I believe so. I believe exactly that, yes.
Okay.
I think that's a pretty good interpretation. And on the second version of the coin, remember, the initial version was a commemorative, and on the side that shows the Madonna with child, it cites the Constitution that has just formally made Costa Rica independent.
Okay.
2 years later, when they issue the regular version of that coin, they've replaced the legend of the Constitution with America Central. So it shows her with the legend Central America, labeling her, basically. So I think that is a very, very good interpretation. Yeah.
For the common symbols, if you will, is there anything besides coinage that could be the vessel or method for migration of symbolism?
Oh yeah, I'm quite sure. I mean, I think this imagery was on virtually every medium imaginable, okay? There was a fella who back in the early 20th century amassed this huge collection of those images of America, right? So I'm talking about the America images from before it showed up on coins and the like. And before he died, he donated half to 2 different institutions in New York City. And if you go through the list of the materials that were donated, they're on boxes, they're on stamps. I don't mean stamps like postage, I mean stamps like to impress an image. Some of them are made of feathers. I mean, I don't even remember exactly how many different media there were. So, and I think you could probably say the same of the images that came along later that were drawn from that. The true America image for the US or for Mexico and Costa Rica and Colombia. I'm sure that that image was transmitted on more than just currency. It was, and you could see it on the paintings, right? It was there on the paintings. I'm pretty sure if we dug down into virtually every aspect of material culture, especially in a decade or two after the wars of independence, you would find that imagery everywhere. Yeah.
Especially as most people in that day and age couldn't read.
Correct. Correct.
One way to communicate.
Right. Another very, very good point. You have to remember that in a lot of these countries, including our own, there was a very high level of illiteracy. And so for many of those people, the only way to sort of have a symbolic exchange was to use images. And these images were more than just the currency of money, they were the currency of ideas at their time, essentially.
So, Peter, in your research, Mexico declares independence 1821.
Correct.
But Iturbide crowns himself. Now they've got just a different form of king. In 1823, did you find any imagery where some form of Iturbide or the crown goes back under the foot?
No, I haven't seen that. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not there, okay? It just means for sure that I simply haven't found it yet.
It'd be interesting to see if
It'd be very interesting to see.
under one more time.
Right, right. No, and you know, that one that, the medal that shows him basically being, you know, crowned by native Mexican liberty predates his actual coronation as emperor.
Yeah.
You know, so they clearly had the crowning in mind, you know, long before it actually ever happened. And it shows up on that medal to prove it,
Yeah.
you know.
Something they regretted 2 years later.
Yeah, something they definitely regretted 2 years later. Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much. All right, appreciate it.